The dining room went quiet the way a room goes quiet, right before something breaks. My mother-in-law, Patricia Voss, was standing at the head of my own table, holding her wine glass like a gavel, looking at me the way she'd looked at me for 11 years, like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "She's from a poor family," Patricia said, loud enough for my daughter to hear from the kitchen doorway. "She doesn't even know our brands." Somebody laughed. I think it was Patricia's sister, Doreen. Somebody else, my husband's cousin Mark, looked down at his plate like the mashed potatoes had suddenly become very interesting. I didn't say anything. I want you to understand that. I've had 66 years of practice at not saying anything, and I've gotten very good at it. My name is Carol Ellison. I was 66 years old that Christmas, a widow for going on 4 years, and I had spent every holiday since marrying into this family in December of 1987, hosting Patricia Voss in my home, cooking her turkey the way she liked it, dry. Because she said moist turkey was common, and absorbing whatever she decided to say to me across whatever table I'd set. That night, I set down my fork. I walked to the sideboard where I kept the television remote, the one hooked up to the smart TV my son-in-law had installed for me 2 Christmases ago, so I could show the grandkids videos of their father as a baby. "Since we're talking about brands," I said, "I think everyone should see something." I pressed play. The video that came up on the screen was 9 days old. It was Patricia, sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon when she thought no one else was home, her voice small and different than the one she used at my table. On the screen, she was asking me, begging me, "Really? There's no softer word for it," for $4,000 to cover a payment on a loan she'd taken out against her condo, a loan her son, my husband David, didn't know about. She said please 6 times in that video. I counted, once, alone in my kitchen the night I saved the file. The room did not gasp, nobody screamed. That's not how these things actually happen. What happened was that 12 people went completely, totally silent, and into that silence, the sound of Patricia's wine glass slipping out of her hand and shattering on my hardwood floor was almost unbearably loud. Nobody moved to help her pick it up, not even Doreen. "Turn that off," Patricia said, but her voice had lost the thing it always had, that certainty, that ownership of the room. "I will," I said. "After everyone understands why I'm not going to apologize for where I come from." I turned it off myself. I didn't need to keep it running. The silence it left behind did more work than any speech I could have given. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing what came before it, and what came before it started 38 years earlier. In a much smaller kitchen, in a house that smelled like my mother's cooking and government-issue soap. I grew up in Mill Haven, Ohio, the third of 5 children. My father worked at a bearing plant for 31 years, and my mother cleaned 2 houses a week on top of raising us. We didn't have brands. We had what fit, what was warm, and what was on sale at the Value City on Route 9. I didn't know that was something to be ashamed of until I married David Voss and met his mother. Patricia Voss came from money that had mostly evaporated by the time I met her, but she held on to the manners of money the way some people hold on to a grudge, carefully, and forever. She wore her mother's pearls to my wedding and told the photographer, within my hearing, that she hoped David would grow out of this phase. I was not a phase. I was 23, working the counter at a pharmacy, and taking night classes toward my nursing degree, and David Voss loved me in the plain, steady way that lasts. We were married for 34 years before the heart attack took him in his sleep, 4 years before that Christmas. In the bed we'd shared in the house we'd bought together in 1994. Patricia never once, in 34 years, called that house a home. She called it the starter place even after we'd lived there for 3 decades and raised 2 children in it. She called my nursing scrubs the uniform, with a particular emphasis that made it sound like I worked at a fast food counter instead of the ICU at St. Agnes. She corrected the way I set a table. She corrected the way I said wash instead of wash, a leftover from my father, God rest him, and she never once did it kindly. David used to apologize for her, quietly, in our bedroom at night. "She's from a different time," he'd say. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds. I let him believe that for longer than I should have, because I loved him. And because loving someone sometimes means agreeing to be a little smaller than you are so the peace can hold. After David died, Patricia's contempt didn't soften with grief the way I'd hoped it might. If anything, it sharpened. Because now there was no David standing between us to absorb it. She started showing up to family gatherings and correcting my grandchildren's manners in front of me. As if I hadn't raised her son into a good man, as if I hadn't been the one who taught our daughter Megan to set a proper table in the first place. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that underneath all of that polish, Patricia Voss was quietly drowning. It started with small things. A cancelled hair appointment she'd had every 6 weeks since I'd known her. A missed payment notice from her country club, forwarded to David's old email address by mistake, that David's estate attorney happened to mention to me because my name was still on some of the paperwork as executor of David's affairs. I didn't think much of it at first. Rich people miss payments too, I told myself. It's probably nothing. Then in October, 3 months before that Christmas, my granddaughter Ava, Megan's oldest, 16 and sharper than any of us, gave her credit for mention that she'd seen her great-grandmother's car, the Lincoln Patricia had driven since I'd known her, parked outside a payday loan office on Route 30. The kind with the flashing yellow sign that says cash today. She was just sitting in the parking lot, Ava said. Not going in. Just sitting there with her hands on the wheel. I didn't say anything to Megan about it. I didn't say anything to anyone. But I started paying closer attention, the way you do when you've spent 30 years as a nurse learning to notice the small signs before the big collapse. I noticed Patricia's rings were gone, first the sapphire, then, a few weeks later, the diamond eternity band David's father had given her. I noticed she'd started declining lunch invitations from her sister Doreen, always with some excuse about her stomach. I noticed the condo she downsized into after David's father passed, the one she talked about constantly. Had a for sale by owner sign go up in the yard for exactly 9 days before it came back down again, quietly, with no explanation. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in December, Patricia came to my house. She didn't call ahead, which wasn't like her. I was in the kitchen making soup, and I heard her key. She still had a key from years ago. From a time when family meant something different between us. Turn in the front door. I almost called out a greeting. Instead, something made me stay quiet in the kitchen doorway and listen, because her voice, when she started talking on the phone in my front hallway, didn't sound like the Patricia I knew. She was on the phone with someone from a lending office. She was asking she was begging for an extension on a loan payment. $4,000, due in 6 days, against a home equity line she'd taken out on the condo without telling David's brother. Without telling anyone, to cover what she eventually admitted, later in that same phone call, was the money I lost. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I only understood that the woman standing in my front hallway, gripping the phone with both hands, sounded nothing like the woman who'd stood at my table for 11 Christmases telling me I didn't know our brands. I did something I'm not entirely proud of, and something I do again without hesitating. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter and I recorded it. Not the whole thing, just enough. Just the part where she said please, 6 times, to a stranger on the other end of a phone line, in a voice that had never once used that word with me. I saved the file. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that something in our family had been sitting crooked for 38 years, and I was finally close enough to see why. What I found out over the following weeks, piece by piece, mostly through David's old estate attorney, and a conversation with Patricia's own son, my brother-in-law, Richard, who lived 2 states away, and had always been the peacekeeper of the family, was worse than a missed loan payment. Patricia had been quietly bailing her youngest son, my husband's brother Kenneth, out of gambling debt for almost 6 years. It started small, Richard told me, $500 here, $1,000 there, framed as helping Kenneth get back on his feet after his divorce. But it had grown. The way these things grow in the dark when nobody's allowed to ask questions, until Patricia had taken a home equity loan against the condo, cashed out a portion of David's father's pension that should have gone into a trust for the grandchildren, and quietly sold, not misplaced, sold the sapphire ring and the diamond eternity band to a jeweler in Cincinnati. And all the while, at every holiday table, in front of every grandchild, Patricia Voss had looked at me, the daughter-in-law from Millhaven, Ohio, who knew how to stretch a grocery budget and had once worked the counter at a pharmacy, and told me I didn't know our brands. I sat with that fact for a long time before Christmas came. I want to be honest with you, for a few days, I let myself feel something ugly and satisfied about it, the way anyone would. But that feeling didn't last. Because underneath the satisfaction was something sadder, the understanding that Patricia had spent 38 years building a version of herself so brittle that she would rather quietly destroy her family's finances than admit, even once, that she needed help. I didn't record that video to humiliate her. I want that understood clearly, even now. I recorded it because I was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that settles into your joints after decades of being the only person in that family who was ever expected to shrink. I brought the video to Christmas dinner not knowing exactly what I would do with it. I brought it the way you bring an umbrella on a cloudy day, hoping you won't need it, knowing you might. Patricia gave me the reason I needed before the turkey was even fully carved. After the glass shattered on my floor that night, after the silence had stretched out long enough that even my grandson stopped chewing, it was my daughter Megan who finally moved. She walked past her grandmother without a word, picked up a dish towel, and knelt down to gather the broken glass, and in that small, ordinary gesture, something in the room shifted because Megan wasn't cleaning up for Patricia. She was cleaning up because the floor was mine, and it was Christmas, and somebody needed to take care of something. Patricia didn't apologize that night. People like Patricia rarely do, not right away, not without something forcing the issue first. She gathered her coat and her purse with what dignity she had left, and asked David's brother Richard to drive her home, and the two of them left before dessert was served, and nobody stopped them. What I didn't know yet, sitting at my own table in the wreckage of a Christmas dinner, was that the video I'd played wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a conversation that would take the rest of that winter to finish, one that would eventually pull in an estate attorney, a very patient bank manager, my brother-in-law Kenneth's own reckoning with a debt he'd hidden from everyone, and a woman I'd spent 38 years being afraid of, sitting across from me at my kitchen table in February, asking, for the first time in either of our lives, an honest question. But that night, I only knew one thing for certain. For 11 Christmases, Patricia Voss had told me I didn't belong at her son's table. She was wrong. It had never been her table. It had always been mine. Richard called me 3 days after Christmas. I almost didn't answer. I'd spent those 3 days doing what I always did after a hard thing, cleaning cabinets that didn't need cleaning, walking my neighbor's dog longer than necessary. Anything to keep my hands busy, so my mind wouldn't circle back to that shattering glass. But Richard had never once called me in 38 years without a reason, so I picked up. She won't eat, he said, without any hello. Mom hasn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. Doreen's worried. I'm worried. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table Patricia had stood beside 3 nights earlier, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Richard, I didn't do that to humiliate her. I know, he said, and I believed him. Richard had always been the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the son who called his mother every Sunday and never asked for anything. But Carol, I need you to tell me what that video actually was. Doreen thinks you doctored it somehow. Mom won't talk about it at all. So I told him. All of it, the phone call I'd overheard, the please repeated 6 times. The $4,000, the 6 days. I told him what I'd noticed over the fall, the missing rings, the for sale sign that came down after 9 days, Ava seeing the Lincoln parked outside the payday loan office on Route 30. There was a long silence on the line. I need to see her financials, Richard finally said. All of them. And Carol, I think I need your help doing it. She trusts you more than she'd ever admit. I laughed, not unkindly, because the idea of Patricia Voss trusting me was almost funny enough to be a joke David would have made. Richard, your mother has spent 38 years telling me I don't belong in this family. I know, he said, again. And I think that's exactly why she might finally listen to you. You're the only person who's never needed anything from her. It took 2 weeks to arrange, and it happened, in the end, not because Patricia invited me, but because Richard essentially walked her into my kitchen on a gray Tuesday afternoon in January. The same kind of gray Tuesday when I'd first overheard her on the phone in my hallway. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, Patricia Voss had always been a tall woman. And she still stood straight, out of a lifetime of habit, but there was something diminished in her that hadn't been there at any Christmas table I'd ever set for her. "I'm not here to apologize," she said, before she'd even taken off her coat. "I didn't ask you to," I said, and poured her a cup of coffee anyway, the way I would have for anyone who walked into my kitchen cold. She sat. Richard sat beside her, a folder of paperwork on the table between them that I understood, without being told, was the reason for this visit. It took another 20 minutes of silence, coffee, and Richard gently prompting his mother, before Patricia finally opened the folder and started, for the first time in her life as far as I knew, telling the whole truth out loud. It had started with Kenneth. Of course it had started with Kenneth. David's younger brother had been the family's soft spot for as long as I'd known any of them, charming and unreliable in exactly the way that charming, unreliable people always seem to find someone willing to catch them. After his divorce 6 years earlier, Kenneth had started gambling, first at the casino 2 hours south then. When that got expensive to maintain even the appearance of control over, online, on his phone, in the dark, alone, he'd come to Patricia first because he was ashamed to come to Richard, and terrified to come to David, who back then was still alive and had never had much patience for Kenneth's excuses. Patricia gave him $500 the first time, framed in her own mind, she said now, as helping him get back on his feet. The second time was $800. By the third year it was a covered credit card payment. By the fifth year it was co-signing a personal loan Kenneth swore he'd pay back and never did. I kept thinking, Patricia said, staring at her coffee cup instead of at either of us, that if I just covered the next thing, it would be the last thing. That's what you tell yourself. You tell yourself, this is the last time. I knew that sentence. I'd heard variations of it from patients' families in the ICU for 30 years, the particular, worn smooth shape of a lie people tell themselves to keep loving someone without having to face what that love is costing them. The home equity loan against the condo had come 2 years ago, taken out quietly. Without David's brother's knowledge, to cover a debt of Kenneth's that had ballooned past anything Patricia could manage on her own income. The portion of David's father's pension money that legally, under the terms of the family trust David's own father had set up, was meant to eventually pass to the grandchildren's education fund had been redirected 18 months ago. With a signature Patricia admitted, quietly, might not have been entirely above board. "You forged Dad's signature?" Richard's voice cracked on the word forged in a way that told me he hadn't expected to say it out loud, even though he must have suspected it from the paperwork. "I borrowed it," Patricia said. "I was going to put it back." "Ma'am." Richard put his head in his hands. I said nothing for a long moment, because this wasn't my fight to referee, and because some part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, but wasn't going to pretend didn't exist, was still sitting with 11 Christmases of being told I didn't know our brands, while the brands, it turned out, had been quietly cannibalizing the family's future the whole time. But another part of me, the part that had spent 30 years as a nurse learning that people rarely fall apart for simple reasons, looked at Patricia Voss, 71 years old, hands shaking slightly around a coffee cup in my kitchen, admitting to forging her late husband's signature to protect a son who'd never once thanked her for it, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt sorry for her. The legal reveal, when it came calmly, the way these things do when the right people are finally in the room. David's old estate attorney, a steady, unhurried man named Harold Fenn, who'd known our family for 22 years, met with Richard, Patricia, and at Patricia's own request, which surprised everyone including me, with me present as well, in early February. Harold laid it out without drama, the way good lawyers do. The forged signature on the pension redirection was, technically, a serious legal problem, but because the money had never left the family, because Patricia's intent had never been personal enrichment, and because Richard, as the trust's other named executor, was willing to work toward restitution rather than prosecution. There was a path forward that didn't involve courtrooms. The condo would be sold properly this time, not the quiet, aborted attempt from the fall, and the proceeds would go first toward repaying the pension fund, with the remainder covering what was left of the home equity loan. Patricia would move into a smaller place, a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from Richard, which she'd resisted for years out of pride, and would now do out of necessity. And Kenneth, who hadn't shown up to a single one of these meetings, who'd been sent a certified letter and had responded with a single evasive voicemail, would finally be required, for the first time in 6 years, to face the debt that had been quietly absorbed by his mother instead of by him. "I want to talk to him myself," Patricia said, when Harold finished laying out the plan. It was the first thing she'd said in almost 20 minutes. "Not through a lawyer, not through Richard. I want to sit across from my son and tell him what this cost." Richard looked at her like he wasn't sure he recognized her. I understood the look, because I wasn't entirely sure I recognized her either. Ava was the one who put it together first, out of anyone in the family under 50, and she did it not through the adults, but through her own careful 16-year-old attention to the things nobody said out loud. She came to me in late February, on a Sunday afternoon when she was supposed to be doing homework at my kitchen table, and instead sat chewing the end of her pencil, watching me fold laundry. "Grandma Carol," she said, "is great-grandma Patricia in trouble because of Uncle Kenneth?" I set down the shirt I was folding. "Why do you ask that?" "Because Mom's been on the phone with Uncle Richard every night this week, and she keeps saying Kenneth's name like it's a bad word. And because I saw the car outside the loan place back in October, and nobody ever explained that. And I'm not stupid, Grandma, I know something happened." I sat down across from her. I thought about all the ways adults in my own childhood had managed money troubles by simply not discussing them in front of the children, as if silence were the same thing as protection, and I decided, in that moment, that Ava deserved better than that. "Your great-grandmother made some serious mistakes," I said carefully, trying to help someone she loves. "It cost her a lot, her home, some of her savings, some of the family's trust in her. She's working now to fix what she can fix." Ava was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you played that video at Christmas?" "Because, you knew I played that video," I said, "because for 11 years, your great-grandmother made me feel small at my own table, and that night, I didn't have it in me to sit quietly through one more insult. I'm not proud of doing it in front of everyone. But I'm not sorry it happened, because it's what finally got the truth into the open." "Do you think she'll ever apologize to you? For the brands thing, and everything else?" I thought about Patricia in my kitchen, coffee cup shaking slightly in her hands, admitting to forgery in front of her own son. I thought about the particular kind of pride that had let her destroy her own finances rather than say the word help out loud to anyone, including me. "I don't know," I told my granddaughter honestly, "but I think, for the first time since I've known her, she might actually be capable of it now. She wasn't before. Some people can't apologize until they've had to sit with exactly how much their pride has cost them." Ava nodded slowly, in the serious way 16-year-olds do when they're filing something away to think about later, and went back to her homework, and I went back to folding laundry. And outside my kitchen window, the last of February's snow was starting, finally, to melt. Kenneth showed up at Patricia's new apartment on a Saturday in April, 3 months after Christmas, and I only know what happened in that room, because Patricia told me herself, weeks later, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd finally started drinking the way I made it, instead of correcting me on it. She told him everything. The forged signature. The condo, the rings, sold quietly to a jeweler in Cincinnati, for a fraction of what they were worth because she'd needed cash fast, and hadn't wanted to ask anyone why. She told him about the months of driving to that payday loan office on Route 30, and sitting in the parking lot, unable to make herself walk inside, ashamed even in front of strangers. "I told him it stops now," Patricia said. "I told him I loved him, and I would always love him, but I was done being his safety net. I told him if he gambles again, he does it knowing there's no one left standing behind him to catch it." "How did he take it?" I asked. "Badly, at first. He said some things." She paused, and I watched her decide, visibly, whether to repeat them. He said I was choosing this moment to develop boundaries, after 6 years of enabling him, and that it was hypocritical. Was he wrong? Patricia looked at me for a long moment, and something passed over her face that I'd genuinely never seen there before in 38 years, something like respect. No, she said. He wasn't wrong. I told him that, too. I told him I'd failed him for 6 years by making it easy to keep failing himself. I told him I couldn't undo that. I could only stop doing it going forward. Kenneth had left angry that day, she said, and hadn't spoken to her for almost 3 weeks after. But he'd called her, eventually, on a Tuesday evening in early April, and asked for the first time in his adult life, as far as anyone in the family could remember, for the name of a counselor. Not money, a name. I gave it to him, Patricia said. And then I hung up the phone, and I cried for the first time since your Christmas table carol, not because I was sad. Because I think, for the first time, I actually did something right by that boy. The condo sold in May, for a fair price, to a young couple expecting their first child, and Patricia moved into her one-bedroom apartment with less furniture than she'd owned in 40 years and, according to Richard, a lighter step than any of us had seen from her in a decade. The pension restitution took longer, working its way through Harold Finn's careful, unhurried paperwork. But by June the education trust for the grandchildren had been made whole again, with Patricia signing over what remained of her own retirement savings to close the gap, rather than let it linger as an open wound in the family ledger. It wasn't a small sacrifice. I understood, watching her sign those papers at Harold's office, that Patricia Voss had spent 71 years building a certain image of herself controlled, correct, above the mess that other families lived in, and that giving up that retirement money was, in its own way, a second confession. Quieter than the first, but no less costly. I hosted the 4th of July that year. It wasn't a tradition David and I had usually gone to Richard's for the 4th, but something in me wanted, after that Christmas, to prove to myself that my table could hold something other than humiliation, that the room where Patricia had once told me I didn't know our brands could also hold something like grace. Patricia arrived early, which she'd never once done in 38 years. Carrying a dish of deviled eggs made from her own mother's recipe, the one she'd never offered to share with me before, in a Tupperware container instead of the good serving dish I knew she owned. Because, she told me quietly in my kitchen, I didn't want to make you feel like you had to match anything today. It wasn't an apology, not in words. But I understood, standing in my kitchen with a woman who'd spent 11 Christmases making me feel small, that this was the closest thing to one that Patricia Voss was capable of giving, and that it was, in its own careful and imperfect way, real. We didn't become close that summer. I want to be honest about that, because I don't believe in pretending 38 years of contempt dissolves into warmth over one shattered wine glass and one shared plate of deviled eggs. But something shifted between us that stayed shifted. She stopped correcting the way I set a table. She started asking, instead of assuming, before she commented on anything in my home. And in August, sitting on my back porch while the grandchildren ran through the sprinkler in the yard, she said the thing I'd waited 38 years to hear. I was wrong about you, Carol. I spent a long time being unkind to you because it was easier than looking at my own life honestly. I'm sorry. I don't expect that to fix anything. I just needed you to hear it. I didn't cry, though I came close. I told her thank you, and I meant it, and we sat together in a silence that, for the first time since I'd known her, didn't feel like something I had to survive. Iva asked me, at Thanksgiving that year, almost a full 12 months after the Christmas that started all of it, whether I regretted playing that video in front of everyone. I thought about it honestly before I answered her, because she deserved an honest answer, not a tidy one. No, I told her. I don't regret it. I think it needed to happen, and I think, if I hadn't done it, your great-grandmother might have kept sinking quietly for years, and none of us would have known until it was too late to fix any of it. But I also don't think I'd do it exactly the same way if it happened again. I was angry, and the anger was earned, but it was still anger doing the choosing that night, not wisdom. Sometimes the right outcome starts from an imperfect choice. That doesn't mean I'd recommend the imperfect choice as the plan. That's a very grown-up answer, Eva said, in the dry way 16-year-olds have of complimenting you while also implying they expected something more dramatic. I'm 67 now, I told her. I've had a lot of practice being a grown-up. That Thanksgiving, Patricia sat 2 chairs down from me, actually laughing. The real kind, not the polished society laugh I'd known for 38 years at something my grandson said about his football team. Kenneth was there too, 6 months into counseling, quieter than I remembered him, but present, and sober, and helping clear plates without being asked. Which was its own small miracle in a family that had spent a long time mistaking silence for peace. I looked around that table, my table, the one Patricia had once implied I didn't deserve to set, and I thought about my father, 31 years at a bearing plant, and my mother, cleaning 2 houses a week, and the girl I'd been behind the pharmacy counter who didn't know a single brand that mattered to Patricia Voss, and never would. I thought, I built this. Every bit of it, the table, the family sitting around it, the grace it took to let a woman who'd hurt me for 11 Christmases back into my home, and mean it when I told her she was welcome. That's not nothing. That's not poor. That's not a woman who doesn't know what matters. That's a woman who knows exactly what matters, and spent a lifetime building it one quiet, unglamorous choice at a time. If you've ever sat at a table where you were made to feel small, I hope you know this. The table doesn't belong to the person who's loudest at it, it belongs to the person who keeps setting it, year after year, with love, even when love isn't returned right away. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, you'll know you never once stopped being the kind of person worth having at the table. Thank you for sitting with our family tonight. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone who finally found their way back, or someone you're still waiting on, I'd love to hear about it. And if you'd like to join us for another story next time, I'll be right here, setting the table again.